Hello. In this episode of Lucid Horizon, we are going to resume our conversation with Professor Hassan Mansour about economic growth and development and the differences between economic growth and development. We were talking about barriers to growth where we had to leave it off at the end of the last program, and we're going to pick it up where we left off, and Professor Mansour is going to continue his conversation about barriers to growth. Professor Mansour, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kangarlu. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Okay, so I just told our audience that our conversation had to stop because you still have a lot to say about barriers to growth, and you're going to resume on this program. Hopefully we can finish it off this time. Please go ahead.
That's true. Well, I will sum up what was told about the market and about the production process. The idea is whether there is any limit or there are limits to growth. To explain this story, we've got to see the market model. The market model in economics, it started with the idea of Dr. Quenet in France, which produced the first tableau économique, the economic table, in which you see the organic relations between the elements of inputs and outputs. So it's a very simple input and output model, which shows that there is no reason for market not to realize what comes into it. It means there's no barrier for sale. This idea is later on admitted indirectly by Adam Smith, who is a harmonist regard, and he doesn't see any problem in the market to produce and sell what is produced. And Ricardo is of the same opinion, that markets would not meet any barriers for selling what is produced into it. This is produced into a model by Jean-Baptiste Say, the French economist. The model is known as market model. He gives a simple idea, and the idea is this: whatever is being produced can be sold. Why? The reasons are, once we produce whatever commodity, we already inject its purchase power into the market system. So the purchase power is already present in the market before the good comes into the market. How do we inject it? It is wages, interest rate, and the rent, the ground rent. These are the elements of production, factors of production, which already are paid for. So you want to build a house or an automobile, you pay wages, you pay interest for capital, and you pay the rent for the site, the land construction on which it's built. So the purchase power of the money is of the commodity is already in the market. So the market is a harmonious system. Well, a minor objection is raised, and that is, well, not necessarily all of the elements of purchase are already injected into the market, because we do not inject profit. Profit comes after the sale. But profit is a part of the interest, and of course, another part of it is the part which covers the risk of the manager. That in itself does not produce a problem for realization of the commodity which comes into the market. So altogether we say, yes, there is a gap, but the problem can always be solved in the market. A person who is presented as a problem was Karl Marx. Karl Marx, in his volume 2 of Capital, presented his model of reproduction, which has been a bone of contention for a long time among economists. He argued that, well, the market process is a process of valorization. It means physically, the elements, the factors are converted. In the meantime, the value is converted. So we buy labor, we buy capital and land, we produce commodities. So even the value changes its form, physical form. Here comes the question of proportionality. Are they proportional? Can we really realize what has been produced in the market? I will get to the idea of Marx, what he meant by it, but this has caused a big controversy at the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century for about 50 years among different schools of economics who've discussed these models, interpreted and sometimes misinterpreted the complex language of Marx in that volume of Capital. But anyway, now let me put this story in a nutshell. There are a group of economists who believed that market is a harmonious system and whatever is produced, it can be, there is no barrier for that because the purchase power is already injected. However, there's another objection which was raised by another French socialist economist whose name was Sismondi. Sismondi believes that no, there is a serious barrier to it. It cannot be realized because in the case of growth, it means that we are injecting 100, say, units of value, $100, and we are getting 110 once we sell it. So for this extra, there is no purchase power injected into the market. This implies that the commodities produced and we are attempting selling it in the market will not be able to sell. It will not be realized. So if you imagine the graphs which I tried to show round 1, round 2, round 3 of production, round 2 being larger than round 1, round 3 being larger than round 2, and so on and so forth, which shows the growth. The question is, when you have the growth, the equivalent of that growth is not present in the market. So the goods which come into the market cannot be sold. This led to an idea of breakdown of the market. This means markets are not harmonious. The people who adhere to this idea, apart from Sismondi himself, was the famous work of Rosa Luxemburg, The Accumulation of Capital. She produced a mathematical, arithmetical model of breakdown, and she showed that, no, this extra growth cannot be realized in the market, so the market is necessarily going to break down. This has political implication, ideological implications. So a group of the socialists thought that capitalist system is not self-sustaining system, it is going to break down. Among these groups, an important group was Russian Narodniks, young socialists it was the same time as Lenin, because Lenin has some adversary to that group. They believe that capitalist system is going to break down. So this idea of breakdown was shared by many. But then the question was, if it's going to break down, every round of production and sale takes about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, depending on what we produce. So in the case of food, which is every 2 or 3 months, is produced, consumed, and reproduced. In the of, say, construction, it is produced every 10 years, 20 years, it's being reproduced. Why doesn't that break down? It is being repeated. But then they had a justification for it. They said, in order to be able to pay for the growth, every expanding round the production, we need an extra source. And this extra source was called pre-capitalist mode of production, a pre-capitalist backyard. So a group of economists believe that we need a pre-capitalist backyard in order to finance the growth of the market. Otherwise, the market will not continue to grow. It will stop and break down. The idea was spread so vast all over the world that not only it was Russia, Europe, but even in Latin America. In Latin America in our 20th century, Prof, an economist, he expressed the idea that in order for each round of growing capitalist economy to sustain itself, we need a non-capitalist sector to contribute to it. Even the Swedish Gunnar Myrdal contributed to this idea. He said, yes, we need an extra source in order to be able to finance the growth. Even Paul Sweezy of United States, but they have different modes or different backyards. What is the backyard being brought in by Paul Sweezy? Paul Sweezy said, yes, this extra amount comes from a non-capitalist sector. And where is it? Well, he found it in Marx's Volume 2 Capital, where there is a luxury sector. Say, well, there are groups of people who are not producers. They do not live on capitalist incomes. They can consume the extra which is being produced, and they have different sorts of incomes themselves. So that income can cover this extra. So even Marx itself, I mean, Marx himself has kind of produced a confusing picture of the story. For the armament sector is a sector which is big, colossal. It's been produced, but it does not need to be consumed because the consumption of armaments is destruction. So it is created and destroyed. So this extra amount of money to be injected comes from somewhere which is not within the same cycle of production. One of the important ideas which became heavyweight in the world of politics was Zedong of China. He developed this idea of backyard into a different form. He believed that this non-capitalist backyard is a mode of production which is pre-capitalist. Feudalism is a must for continued life of developed capitalism. Hence his famous ideology of the marriage of feudalism and imperialism. He thought that imperialism would not, which is a developed mode of capitalism, would not be able to survive without feudalism. If this is the case, then the imperialist power in the world will try to impede the development of feudalist lands into capitalism.
So by feudalism, you really mean economy bound to the land. You don't mean the political system of feudalism, right?
No, indeed, he means political system of political or the feudal strata within a society. You see, once in a society, you have the capitalist mode. Normally, capitalist mode is developed in the development poles within the large cities and metropoles. Meantime, you need the land reform to bring the feudal part of the society into the market, which is a process and takes time. What Mao says is that, well, the existence of a non-capitalist mode is always necessary. So not all the feudalist strata are going to be integrated into the market model. It's going to remain. So far, if I can try and sum up, I have mentioned two schools. One school was the harmony school, which believed that there is no barrier to growth. It can always continue. The second one was those who believe that no, a backyard is necessary, in the absence of which the system of market is going to break down. And of course, this played into the hands of revolutionary forces, say Narodniks and Rosa Luxemburg, who became guerrilla warfare people. They become guerrillas because they believe that capitalism is going to break down and we need to administer the final blow in order to make it fall. Then was a third school, or the third interpretation. This emerged from within the Marxist camp. Engels was one of the first. Lenin, he wrote analyses and so on. One important articles he wrote was the answer to Mrs. Strove, in which he analyzed Marx's model of volume 2 and showed that no, according to Marx, the system can continue. Yes, there is a barrier, but this barrier can overcome. They extracted this idea of overcoming, the possibilities of overcoming this barrier, from Capital Volume 2 itself. The capitalists would always inject tomorrow's money into today's cycle. So they can always borrow money from tomorrow and inject in today. This means that we make an investment of, say, 10 million and 11 million is produced. This 1 million of extra needs money. The credit system is there to finance this extra. So we borrowed, it is the value which did not exist in the market system, but we can borrow it from the banking system and inject in the system, so the system goes on. Next round, we'll make another borrowing, another borrowing, another borrowing. This is why Marx's spiral can continue. This was the idea that Marx himself meant, that it can continue, but we can always borrow from future and spend for today. So next round, again, we're going to borrow from future. This means we get the money which is not still produced from the banking system in the form of credit and inject into the market. So the market can continue. But does this make Marx a harmonist among economists, that there's no breakdown? But we know that Marx is a breakdown theory. He has a theory of breakdown. He has a theory of revolution or chaos. Chaos, which means to a revolution. And we know the idea that Lenin produced on this one. Marx's idea shows that, yes, you can harmoniously borrow from the banking system, inject into the production system in order to make the commodities produced in the market realizable. But there are conditions in which borrowing will not be possible, because whatever is injected into the market will only bring about inflation and will not cause the right for continuation of production. There will not be any market, because there's always a slack in the demand. Demand is always short. So borrowing from the from the banking system, which is the credit system, there will be a condition where the injection of money does not stimulate the economy anymore. In those conditions, stimulation will stop and the conditions of chaos will reign. And Lenin built his own theory of revolution on this point. This is why he believed that, yes, capitalist system will not break down, but it will get entangled into chaotic situations. In those chaotic situations, revolutionary party must step in and administer the final blow. Here comes this theory of revolution. Now, I think we have now clarified that there are three schools. The first school believes in the harmony of the market, that there is no barrier to the growth. The second, which starts with Sismondi, they argue that there is always a barrier, and at every round, it's a difficulty as what we have produced. And the third school is, yes, there are barriers, but it can always be overcome. But after many rounds of production, there will be a condition in which assimilation is impossible. Then the chaos will reign, and that is the point of breakdown. In the absence of a revolutionary party, the system will not break down. So the revolutionary party is an extra element which Lenin brings in, and he builds his own theory of revolution. So far, the idea of production and realization or selling of the goods in the market. And this is all about the growth. We have been talking about the growth so far. The point we're going to address later is, in the process of growth, a quality change is always taking place, step by step. And this we experience in any country which goes through the process of growth. In 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, in the case of Iran, we had 11 years of very dramatic growth of 11.5% per year. The size of the Iranian economy trebled.
This was which years?
And we could feel 1963 to 75.
Very good.
75, even 76, when we come to the period of stagflation, which precedes the revolution. So there is about 11 or 12 years of very high growth. During this period, we have experienced that growth went on smoothly. The system of banking developed.
Can I ask a question here? This is something that a lot of people are raising about that period of growth between 1963 to 1976. A lot of people attribute that growth entirely and exclusively to the increase in the price of oil. Is there anything, so far as the performance of the economy of Iran, that contributed to this growth separate from the increase in the price of oil?
Well, historically, the price of oil increased 1973, not before. 73, 74, 75. So those are the years in which we have a high income from oil. Indeed, the price of oil quadrupled, increased 4 times. But it was only last 2.5 years before revolution, not before. So the growth we're talking about, it was not oil related. Of course, we had oil income. The regime was trying to expand the amount of oil produced. And of course, it's a very fascinating story to see how the Shah was trying to increase the amount of production until he arrived at the very maximum limit of about 6 million barrels per day. He was always exerting pressure on oil companies to increase the amount of oil to sell. And there were complications among oil companies, the consortium oil companies, and so on and so forth. So far as until about, if I don't mistake the story, the date, it was under 1973 that even the Shah of Iran didn't know why the oil companies could not comply with his demand of increasing the amount of oil as in tandem with what he wanted. In that year, he learned through a company, another company, which was a rival company, that there was a hidden agreement among the consortium companies who were developing the oil of the area. So there was an internal planning. This is why they could not abrogate their own plans in order to give higher portion to Iran's production. But anyway, this increase of oil income was from 1973, end of 1973, 74, 75. Then the oil income became about 3-4 times. It was the price of oil went from about less than $2.5 per barrel to about 14, and later on fluctuated down to about 10. And we remember that the Shah of Iran was arguing that $7 per barrel will be a good price. And this, of course, caused a great deal of blame for him from his opponents, saying that, well, the market is now about 10, but the Shah of Iran is trying to reduce the price. While the Shah of Iran and the proposal of him as to the $7 was the only reasonable answer in the market, because he knew the marginal cost of production of North Sea was $7. And this is a golden economic rule, that the price is always, after competition, boils down to the marginal price of production, the price or the cost of the marginal producer. Then it was North Sea. So the Shah of Iran has based his analysis or understanding on the very solid facts of the market. Anyway, to get from here, before that, no, the growth was, the growth in Iran did not depend on increased oil income, but on increased production of oil and accommodation of the market, which allowed Iran to produce more and more oil and to bring it in market. And of course, even contributions from the West for Iranian finances, great deal of foreign investment in Iran. And of course, the reforms which were performed during those 10 years, land reform and so on and so forth, which were called the 6 pillars of revolution, later on became 9, 10, 11, 12 pillars of revolution. And all this, it brought about a big structural change in the market, and the growth was built on that increased production. During that period, the GDP of Iran increased about 3-folds. And the income, that is income per capita, it increased by about three times and a bit more, 3 times. But this is the story of growth in which we find elements which led to revolution later on. I have mentioned that in our study of the industrial site of Karaj around Tehran, we found their problems, and of course the support they received from different organizations in order to run the production. And of course, in a matter of 10 years, great many industries were produced around, and Iran gradually became one of the very considerable forces in the market within Iran, and later on it started exporting its industrial products even to other countries. But our studies show that the process of growth was kind of smooth and harmonious. It took about 4 or 5 years, and in some areas even less, for the workforce, engineers, technicians, to cope with the requirements of technique. The management system was improved. We got even managerial schools in Iran and the techniques of management were learned and absorbed by all these new organizations. But another element grew, and that was the dissatisfaction or disillusionment with this growth, which led to changes beside the economic and technical area. What was that? It required the development changes the quality of workforce, quality of education, for which you get different schools, new schools, and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, the changes in law, which demanded equality, first to protect the workers, but equality of genders, men and women. Here again, here is the first elements of resistance. There are institutions within the society which react to it. And they say, no, this is not going to be absorbable. We are not going to accept that. So the change in the structure of family, it means the creation of new family sorts, which are the nucleus family, husband, wife, and children. Expanded family is being put aside or is being kept in the small towns and countryside. In Tehran, great many people who find employment either from small cities or from countryside, they all get their wives and children, and the nucleus family grows. Nucleus family demands its own style of life. So they get each a car, a pecan, and they have their own style of life, which means that they have a life inside home and a life outside, cafeterias, cafes, nightlife, and so on. It develops. All this development requires a change in traditions, a change in religious traditions. Here comes the main barrier, and it builds up. So during the last 2-3 years, gradually we feel, not even 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, creation of new religious establishments like Irshad, Hosseini Irshad in Tehran, in which the so-called modernists Muslims, they start preaching, but they are against freedom of women, equality of women. They propagate the Islamic tenets and teachings, and they grow bigger and bigger and bigger. The reaction of other institutions like Bazaar in Iran, the reaction of Bazaar, even if they were benefiting from the development and the growth, in the meantime, they were the main source of income of Ayatollahs, because they had the same values, many of them had the same values as the mullahs had. And this is why they could finance them and their activities and their publications. In this regard also, the regime itself had some miscalculations, because the regime itself believed that, well, they could use the force of the tradition against the opposition, which was mostly leftist. So they also tolerated the growth of these institutions like the Reaction Bazaar, reactionary clergy, tens of thousands of new mosques, and religious teachings. Annually, you could see that even in the central streets of Tehran, you could see women bearing veils and coming into the street with veils. And this became a sign of revolutionary objection to dictatorship. Then you had the organization like Mujahideen, who could appear in University of Tehran with the chadors and veils.
So is it correct?
Here we can see.
Is it correct? Is it correct to say that, you know, here you're comparing economic growth and economic development, and you beautifully laid down the factors contributing to the economic growth in Iran during 1963 to 1979. And then you summarize the economic development part of the society. And now you're saying that the revolution actually happened not as a backlash to economic growth, but as a reaction to economic development. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. That's right. I'll mention barriers which also accompanies growth. Even if I mention that the question of the market is an element. So any growth requires internal and external markets. In Iran, this growth developed and created its own internal market. And as an external market, it didn't feel fierce competition from others. It could develop and start exporting to neighboring countries. But in the longer run, there are elements which can be a barrier to development and growth. Here I'm confusing these two, or mixing these two elements of growth and development together, because one barrier comes with the growth of industry, growth of the market. As I mentioned in those theories who believe that to develop the market, there's a limit in the market, and the market is the area of competition between different capitalist countries. So there's a limit. And those who believed in the backyard, they will argue that there are forces in the market which will push back the new country which is entering the market, because the size of the market is limited, and they would not allow new forces to enter the market. And unfortunately, this theory, which economically is not sound, it does have certain adherents. It does have certain adherents even among the policymakers. So you look at certain things, events in the world, it will be difficult to explain why it happened without having such a theory. I remember Jean-Pierre Chevènement, the French internal minister. He wrote a book titled The Green and the Greenback. Le vert et le noir. And he meant by the greenback dollar, and black was oil. In the meantime, with black, he meant the reactionary religion. So it was it was an implication anyway. The book was a bestseller. It was very good. And I wrote a letter to Jean-Pierre Chevènement and said, well, how would you explain this fact? It was the time of Iraqi War. The first American war in Iraq, which even if General Schwarzkopf said in an interview that in 2 or 3 days, I had blinded Saddam Hussein and his army because I had destroyed all his radar system. He couldn't see what we were doing. But the destruction continued for about two months. All roads and bridges and waterways and aqueducts and electrical system were beaten down to the Stone Age. The question was, why? Once your enemy is defeated, why do you destroy the infrastructure? This can only be explained by adherence to that theory, which requires that, well, you need a pre-capitalist mode for development of capitalism. So in case a country gets enough basis for development, you've got to push it back. So I asked him, do you think this kind of thinking, which I think is wrong, do you think this prevailed? He wrote to me saying that, I think so. I'm not saying that he was correct, but I see that in some areas, it does play a role. The market situation is always, the market is the breathing space of any production, any industry. It has got to be enough for all the producers, and is the area of fierce competition. But in case there are forces who accept or believe that there is a limit in the market and cannot accept all the goods being brought into it, then of course they will try to stop the flow of products from those areas. This, at least, is among some forces or some policymakers who may adhere to this theory, which is not scientifically solid and correct. But the other aspect, which is internal, that is external. It becomes from the rivals. But the internal impediment comes in with the development itself. When your development brings in wealth, extra wage, better jobs, automobiles, new roads, and so on, it is accepted and welcome. But when it leads to changes in your mode of life, inequality between genders, in the change of family laws, in the change of lifestyle, then there is a resistance to it which is homegrown. I refer to this idea as a paradigm change. At a given stage, in the growth, development is going to take place, and development requires paradigm change. Without paradigm change, development is not going to install and thrive. So it may break down. So to conclude today's discussion, I will sum up what I said, that with Iran's experience, in Iran, we had a period of growth of about 10 to 12 years, which is very welcome. Welcome even by the nation, by the people, by the younger generation, the growth of population, the growth of wealth, the growth of living standards, and so on and so forth, and the growth of the respect of the country all over the world. So this can be analyzed, and the elements which contributed to this growth can be analyzed. It needed a government which was committed to growth, that we had. And then mobilization of the forces and education and culture and so on, and that we had. We needed the spirit of growth, which is the young generation, their energy and help in the marketplace that was there. So it was mobilized, and correct organizations were there, and they were organized, and the growth was made. But in the meantime, we could not clear the impediments created by development. They created and built up the resistance, and resistance formed itself in the form of reactionary institutions within society. One is the traditional structure of the market in Iran. It has always played a dual role for progress sometimes, but a role for reaction great many times. So you take any example, in a period of about 1 year, they have supported Mossadegh during the period of nationalization, but later on they have turned back their back. Once they realized that the oil income is not coming in, is not flowing in, they turned their back to Mossadegh and they sided with Kashani and the clergy. So one reactionary institution was the bazaar, the family structure, the traditional countryside, and traditional layers of society in the towns, led by clergy. They could lead to the backlash of revolution, and Iranian development was really castigated, and it stopped there. So I think I can sum up and stop our today's discussion here. Next time we may address the question of the requirements of growth and development for Iran. What should be and what kind of lessons could we learn from our experience in order to make development possible in Iran? Because without development, growth cannot continue. As a final point, to mention this, that our development in the history of about 110 years, it has always been curtailed and frustrated. Iranian constitutionalist revolution failed in realizing development for Iran. The rule of Reza Shah, a dictatorial, benevolent dictator working for growth. It worked for about 16, 17 years, but it was due to the combination of internal and external factors, it also failed. Then we have a period of about 10 years of the new Shah, the Mohammad Reza Shah, during which there was no question of growth and development, and the country was in chaos until the nationalization of oil. But of that, of the coup and the establishment of a new kind of dictatorial regime, we had the development. The start of development, which was the growth, and later on we came to the hurdles of growth, which was the impediments to development, and the system collapsed again. So after that, we have the new force in the country, which is a new Islamic government. Islamic government had the advantage that the previous governments didn't have. Mass mobilization. It had the masses with them. But could they achieve growth? No. Development, it was not even that. Development was not in the agenda of the new regime, but growth was, because they wanted more money, more wealth. What has happened? During the 40 years, the income per capita of any Iranian has gone down to 57%. It means from every $100, any Iranian has lost $43. They get less today. Even in growth, it has failed. The question is, why do we fail? If a nation fails 4 times, the lessons learned. What makes us fail, and why don't we succeed in achieving development, getting to become those countries that we have been once equal with, like South Korea? They started with us, but now their production is about 5.5 times Iranian production now. While once we made the revolution, their GDP was about 60% of the Iranian GDP. So all these are important questions which we need to add in a separate session.
Thank you very much
now,
for a thorough...
Here I'm done. In case you have any question or commentary, you're most welcome.
Yes, I have a lot of questions, but since they are going to take more than a couple of minutes time that we have, I'm going to postpone them to the next show, and we are going to bring this conversation to an end here. And I thank you very much for a comprehensive and exciting and insightful knowledge that you are spreading among all our viewers. And for that, on behalf of all our viewers, I thank you very much, Dr. Mansour. And we are going to sign off here and get back the next week with the 11th episode of Lucid Horizon. Thank you very much, Professor Mansour.
I'm grateful. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much indeed.